The hardest step I ever took was not the first step after my recovery. It was the moment I realized my husband had already walked away before I was strong enough to stand on my own. I still remember the morning I opened my eyes and looked toward the empty chair beside my hospital bed. For weeks, that chair had been where Michael sat. He was the person who promised me he would stay through everything. He was the person who held my hand when I was afraid. Or at least that was the man I believed I knew. My name is Claire Bennett, and before my life changed, I thought I understood what family meant. I was 34 years old, living in Denver, Colorado, with my husband Michael and our 2-year-old daughter, Lily. We were not a perfect family, but I believed we were a strong one. We had ordinary mornings, ordinary dinners, and ordinary conversations about the future. Those ordinary moments were the ones I valued most. I never expected that one day I would look back at them as memories from a completely different life. The accident changed everything. I do not remember every detail from that time, but I remember the feeling of waking up and realizing my body no longer moved the way it used to. Simple things became difficult. Sitting up, standing, taking a few steps across the room. Things I once did without thinking became challenges I had to face every day. The doctors told me recovery would take patience. They told me progress would come slowly. So I learned to celebrate small victories. The first time I stood without assistance. The first time I moved across the room by myself. The first time I held Lily without feeling afraid that I could not support her. Those moments mattered because they reminded me that I was still there. I was still Claire. But while I was learning how to walk again, something else in my life was quietly falling apart. Michael started changing. At first, I made excuses for him. I told myself he was overwhelmed. I told myself he was scared. I told myself that watching someone you love struggle was not easy. I wanted to believe that the distance between us was temporary. But then the phone calls became shorter. The visits became less frequent. The promises became fewer. One evening, while Lily was sleeping in the next room, I asked Michael if he was okay. I expected him to tell me he was tired. I expected him to say we would get through this together. Instead, he looked away and said he did not know how much longer he could handle everything. I remember those words because they felt heavier than anything I had faced during recovery. Not because he admitted he was struggling, but because I realized I was struggling too, and I had been carrying both of us. The person I thought would stand beside me was slowly stepping away. I spent many nights looking at Lily sleeping peacefully and wondering how I was supposed to explain a world where promises could disappear. But every morning I still got up, even when getting out of bed took longer than I wanted, even when I felt uncertain about the future. I had a daughter who needed me. I had a life I was not ready to give up on. I did not know then that the hardest part of my journey was not learning how to walk again. It was learning how to move forward without the person I thought would always be beside me. And I did not know that the day would come when the same man who left me during my weakest moment would return, not with an apology, but with a challenge that would change everything. Before everything changed, Michael and I had a story that I believed would last forever. Looking back now, I realize that sometimes people do not leave all at once. Sometimes they leave in small pieces. A missed conversation, a forgotten promise, a moment when you need them most, and they are somewhere else. I did not see those signs clearly at first because I was holding on to the version of my husband I remembered. The man who used to bring me coffee on quiet mornings. The man who smiled when he held our daughter for the first time. The man who promised me that no matter what happened, we would face life together. We met in our late 20s when life still felt full of possibilities. Michael was the kind of person who made plans. He talked about the house we would buy, the places we would visit, and the family we would create. When Lily was born, I thought our lives had finally reached the chapter we had always dreamed about. I remember sitting in the hospital room after she arrived, watching Michael hold her carefully. He looked at me and said, "We are going to give her the best life we can." Those words stayed with me for years. They became part of the reason I kept believing in us even when things became difficult. After my accident, our entire routine changed. The life we once knew disappeared almost overnight. Instead of planning weekend trips or talking about home projects, our conversations became about appointments, recovery schedules, and daily challenges. I understood that it was not easy for Michael either. I knew he had his own fears. I knew seeing me struggle was painful. That was why I tried to be patient. I tried to make things easier for him whenever I could. Even while I was the one learning how to take my first steps again, I worried about how he was handling everything. That was who I was. I always looked for ways to protect the people I loved. But slowly, I started noticing that I was the only one trying to hold our family together. There were mornings when I waited for Michael to come by before my therapy session. Sometimes he arrived late. Sometimes he did not come at all. When I asked what was wrong, he always had a reason. Work was stressful. He needed space. He was tired. I listened because I wanted to understand. I did not want to become another problem he had to carry. But there was one evening I will never forget. Lily was sitting on the floor coloring while I watched her from the couch. I had just finished another difficult day of therapy. My body was exhausted, but my mind was still trying to stay hopeful. Michael came home later than usual and sat across from me. The room was quiet. I remember the sound of Lily turning the pages of her coloring book. Then Michael said something I never expected to hear. "I do not know if I can keep doing this." I looked at him, waiting for him to explain. I thought he meant he needed help. I thought he meant he was overwhelmed and wanted us to find a solution together. But what he meant was that he was questioning whether he wanted this life anymore. I felt something inside me change in that moment. Not because I suddenly stopped loving him. I did not. Love does not disappear because someone disappoints you. But I realized I could not keep carrying the weight of two people while pretending I was not struggling myself. The hardest part was that I still wanted to believe he would choose us. I wanted him to remember the promises he made before life became difficult. I wanted him to see the woman who was fighting every day to become stronger again. Instead, I watched him slowly create distance between us. And while I was focused on rebuilding my ability to walk, I had no idea I was also being forced to rebuild my entire life from the ground up. The weeks that followed were the hardest part of my recovery, not because my body was failing me, but because I was slowly accepting that the person I expected to stand beside me was choosing to step away. Every morning, I woke up and looked at the same bedroom ceiling. For a few seconds, before reality returned, I would forget everything had changed. I would imagine Michael walking into the room with his usual morning coffee and asking how I slept. Then I would remember the empty space beside me. I would remember that the life I had planned was no longer the life I was living. My physical therapist always reminded me that progress did not happen overnight. She told me to focus on one step at a time. I carried those words with me every day. Some mornings, taking a few steps across the room felt like a victory. Other mornings, it felt like starting over. But no matter how difficult the day was, I had Lily waiting for me. She was the reason I pushed forward. She was 2 years old and too young to understand why her father was not around as much anymore. She would ask simple questions that were harder to answer than anything else. "When is Daddy coming home? Is Daddy busy today?" I always tried to respond with kindness because I did not want my daughter to carry the weight of adult problems. I wanted her to feel safe. I wanted her childhood to still have moments of happiness. But inside, I was grieving a family that was changing before my eyes. Michael did not disappear completely. That almost made it harder. If he had walked away entirely, maybe I would have understood my reality sooner. Instead, he appeared just enough to keep my hope alive. He would visit Lily. He would ask about my recovery. He would say things like, "I am trying to figure things out." I held on to those words because I wanted to believe there was still something worth saving. I thought maybe this was just a difficult chapter, not the end of our story. But one evening, I realized I was the only one waiting for the old life to return. Michael came by to pick up a few of his belongings. The house felt different with him there. It was still the same house, the same walls, the same furniture, but it no longer felt like our home. I watched him walk through the rooms we had chosen together. I watched him look at the pictures on the wall. For a moment, I wondered if he remembered the same memories I did. "Are we going to be okay?" I asked quietly. He stopped for a moment. I waited for him to say something comforting. Instead, he said, "I do not know." Those 3 words told me more than any long explanation could have. After he left, I sat near the window and watched the street outside. Families were walking their dogs. Neighbors were coming home from work. The world continued moving as if mine had not changed. That night, I made a decision. I could not spend every day waiting for someone else to choose me. I had to choose myself and my daughter. The next morning, I approached my recovery differently. I stopped measuring my progress by what I had lost. I started measuring it by what I was rebuilding. I celebrated standing longer. I celebrated walking farther. I celebrated every moment I was able to be present for Lily. I began creating a new routine. Breakfast together. Therapy appointments. Quiet evenings reading books with my daughter. It was not the life I had imagined, but it was still a life worth fighting for. I still miss Michael. I still wondered why things had changed, but I was beginning to understand something important. Someone leaving does not mean you are left without value. Sometimes the people who walk away create the space where you finally learn how strong you can become. I did not know what the future held. I did not know that Michael would eventually return with a legal challenge that would test everything I had rebuilt. At that moment, I only knew one thing. I was no longer waiting for someone else to save me. I was learning how to stand on my own again. The first months after Michael moved out were filled with moments I never expected to face. There were mornings when I would sit at the edge of my bed, looking at my shoes, wondering if I had enough energy to begin another day. There were appointments, exercises, and countless small challenges that reminded me how different my life had become. But there was also something else growing inside me, a strength I never knew I had. I stopped waiting for Michael to come back and started building a life that did not depend on his choices. My days became centered around Lily and my recovery. Every morning, I prepared her breakfast before starting my own routine. I learned how to balance caring for a toddler while continuing my therapy. It was not easy, but I discovered that confidence does not always arrive in big moments. Sometimes it appears quietly when you do something you once thought you could not do. One afternoon, I walked from the living room to the kitchen without stopping. It was only a short distance, but I stood there for a moment and smiled. A few months earlier, that simple walk felt impossible. Now it was proof that I was moving forward. I wanted to share that moment with Michael because, despite everything, a part of me still hoped he would see how hard I was trying. But when I told him during a phone call, his response was not what I expected. "That is good," he said. His voice was polite, but distant. There was no excitement.
No pride.
No sense that this was something we had overcome together. I ended the call and sat quietly for a while. That was when I accepted something I had been avoiding. Michael was no longer experiencing this journey with me. He was simply watching from the outside. As time passed, our conversations became less about our family and more about practical matters. He asked about schedules. He asked about arrangements. He asked questions that sounded like they came from someone managing a situation rather than someone caring for the people involved. I noticed the difference, but I did not argue. I had learned that forcing someone to understand your pain rarely creates understanding. Sometimes people only recognize what they have lost after they stop receiving what you constantly gave. About 8 months after my recovery began, Michael asked to meet. I agreed because I believed we needed an honest conversation. We met at a quiet coffee shop near my neighborhood in Denver. I arrived early and watched people passing by outside the window. Parents walking with their children. Couples sharing conversations. Ordinary moments that once felt so simple. When Michael arrived, he looked different. Not physically, but emotionally. He seemed more focused on what he wanted to say than what I needed to hear. After a few minutes of small talk, he placed a folder on the table. I looked at it but did not touch it. "What is this?" I asked. He took a breath and said he wanted to discuss his concerns about Lily and our future arrangements. At first, I thought he wanted to find a better way for us to communicate as parents. I thought maybe he wanted to rebuild trust. But then he explained that he had spoken with an attorney and wanted to make changes through legal channels. I listened carefully. The woman sitting across from him was not the same woman who had been afraid and uncertain months earlier. I was still surprised. I was still hurt. But I was no longer lost. "Michael," I said calmly, "after everything we have been through, is this really how you want to handle things?" He looked uncomfortable. He said he believed he was doing what was necessary. That word stayed with me. Necessary. It was a word people used when they wanted to make difficult choices sound easier. I returned home that evening and looked at Lily sleeping peacefully in her room. I thought about everything I had overcome. I thought about the days when I wondered if I would ever walk normally again. I thought about the nights when I felt completely alone. Then I realized something important. I had already survived the hardest part. The woman who had once waited for someone to choose her was gone. I was no longer asking Michael to see my worth. I knew it myself. And whatever came next, I was ready to face it with the same patience and determination that helped me take my first steps again. The days after my conversation with Michael felt strangely quiet. Not because nothing was happening, but because I finally understood that my life was entering a new chapter. For months, I had been focused on healing my body. Now, I had to prepare myself for something different. I had to protect the life I had rebuilt for Lily and myself. I did not want conflict. I did not want bitterness. I simply wanted stability. But I was beginning to realize that wanting peace does not always mean other people will choose the same thing. A few weeks after our meeting, I received official paperwork from Michael's attorney. I remember holding the envelope in my hands and sitting at the kitchen table. The same table where I had fed Lily breakfast every morning. The same table where I had spent countless hours planning our future. I stared at the papers for a long time before opening them. There was a strange feeling that came with seeing everything written down. Something that had once been a private family struggle was now becoming a formal process. Words that belonged in conversations between two people who once loved each other were now printed on legal documents. I read every page carefully. Michael was requesting changes regarding parenting arrangements and responsibilities. He believed he was making a reasonable decision. He believed he was protecting his relationship with Lily. I wanted to understand that. A part of me still hoped there was a misunderstanding. I hoped maybe someone had advised him poorly. I hoped maybe he did not realize how painful this felt after everything we had experienced. But then I remembered something important. When I needed support the most, I had been the one learning how to move forward. I had been the one waking up early for therapy appointments. I had been the one finding ways to care for Lily while rebuilding my own strength. I was not angry because Michael wanted to be involved in our daughter's life. I wanted Lily to have a loving relationship with both parents. What hurt was the way he had chosen to return. Not through a conversation, not through understanding, but through a legal battle. I contacted an attorney who specialized in family matters. Walking into that office was not easy. I never imagined I would need to sit across from someone and explain the details of my own family. But the attorney did something that surprised me. She did not start by asking about Michael. She asked about Lily. She asked about our daily routine. She asked about my recovery. She asked who had been there during those difficult months. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was looking at the entire story instead of only one moment. I began gathering everything I had never thought I would need. Medical records from my recovery, therapy schedules, notes about Lily's daily care, messages between Michael and me. Not because I wanted to attack him. I did not want to make him look like a bad person. I simply wanted the truth to be clear. There is a difference between seeking revenge and protecting what matters. I learned that difference during those weeks. Some people think strength means being the loudest person in the room. I learned that real strength can be quiet. It can look like organizing documents at midnight after your child falls asleep. It can look like showing up to appointments even when you feel exhausted. It can look like choosing calm when someone else chooses conflict. One evening, after Lily went to bed, I sat on the couch and looked at the small progress I had made over the past year. The walking exercises, the moments of independence, the confidence I slowly rebuilt. I realized something. Michael had taken a step away from our family, but he had not taken away my ability to move forward. I had already faced the fear of losing the life I knew. I had already learned how to stand again. The upcoming court process was another challenge, but it was not the same as before. This time, I was not the woman waiting for someone to come back. I was the woman who had learned how to continue without them. The weeks leading up to the court hearing taught me something I never expected to learn. I thought the hardest part of my journey was learning how to walk again. I thought the hardest days were the ones when I had to ask for help doing things that once came naturally. But preparing for court showed me a different kind of challenge. It was not about my body. It was about staying calm while my entire life was being examined by people who did not know the full story. Every evening after Lily went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table and organized everything carefully. I placed documents into folders. I reviewed dates. I wrote down details I had almost forgotten. Not because I wanted to create a battle, but because I wanted to make sure the truth was not lost. My attorney reminded me that facts mattered more than emotions. She told me to focus on what I had done for Lily, not on what Michael had failed to do. That advice stayed with me. For a long time, I had been focused on the pain of being left behind. I had replayed the moments when Michael stopped showing up. I had wondered what I could have done differently. But as I reviewed my records, I started seeing something I had overlooked. I had been stronger than I gave myself credit for. I had continued showing up every day. I had taken Lily to appointments. I had followed every recommendation from my recovery team. I had created a stable home even when my own life felt uncertain. Those things were not dramatic. They were not the kind of things people notice from the outside. But they mattered. One afternoon, Michael called. His voice sounded different than it had during our previous conversations. He sounded more careful. "Claire, I think we should try to make this easier for everyone," he said quietly, listening. A part of me wanted to believe this was a chance for us to finally have an honest conversation. I wanted to believe he understood how much the situation had hurt me. "I have always wanted what is best for Lily," I said. "So have I," he replied. "But I noticed something. We were using the same words, but we were not talking about the same things. I wanted Lily to feel loved and secure. I wanted her to grow up knowing both parents cared about her." Michael seemed focused on proving his position. After we ended the call, I looked at the family photo on the refrigerator. It was taken before everything changed. Lily was smiling between us, and Michael had his arm around my shoulder. I remembered that woman in the photograph. She believed love meant always finding a way to fix things. She believed patience could solve almost anything. I still respected that part of myself. But I also knew I could not keep ignoring reality. The night before the hearing, I prepared Lily's clothes for the next day and packed her favorite book in her bag. Simple things. Normal things. Those were the moments I wanted to protect. Not arguments. Not paperwork. Not the opinions of people who only knew pieces of our story. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at myself. I saw the same woman who had struggled to take her first steps. But I also saw someone different. Someone who had learned that strength was not about never falling. Strength was about getting up every time life changed direction. When I arrived at the courthouse, I saw Michael waiting outside. For a moment, I remembered the person he used to be. The person who promised to stand beside me. There was sadness in that memory, but there was no anger. I simply walked forward. I was not there to destroy him. I was there to speak for the life Lily and I had built. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely steady. Not because the situation was easy, not because I knew what the outcome would be, but because I finally understood that my voice mattered too. Walking into the courtroom that morning felt different from anything I had experienced before. I had walked into hospitals. I had walked into therapy sessions. I had walked into rooms where doctors told me I would need patience and determination. But this was different. This was a place where my role as a mother, my choices, and the life I had built for Lily would be examined. I held my folder close as I entered the building. It was filled with documents, memories, and proof of the everyday moments that never made headlines but mattered the most. Michael was already there. He looked calm, dressed professionally, and prepared for the day ahead. For a moment, I saw the man I married. The man who used to laugh with me in our kitchen. The man who held our daughter when she was born. That memory appeared for just a second before I reminded myself why I was there. I was not there to revisit the past. I was there to protect the future. When the hearing began, I expected to feel overwhelmed. I thought I would be nervous sitting in front of strangers discussing such personal parts of my life. But something unexpected happened. I felt calm. Maybe it was because I had already faced my biggest fear. I had already experienced losing the life I thought I would have. I had already learned how to rebuild myself from a place where I felt completely uncertain. The questions began. They asked about my recovery. They asked about my ability to care for Lily. They asked about our daily routine. I answered honestly. I did not exaggerate my struggles, and I did not hide them either. I explained that there were days when recovery was difficult, but I never stopped showing up for my daughter. I explained the appointments, the routines, the small victories, and the responsibilities I carried every day. Then it was Michael's turn to speak. I listened carefully. He talked about wanting to be involved in Lily's life. He talked about his concerns and his hopes for the future. Part of me appreciated that he wanted to remain a parent. Lily deserved love from both of us. But I noticed something. His words focused on what he wanted now. They did not include much about the months when I was learning to stand again. They did not include the mornings when I struggled but still prepared breakfast for our daughter. They did not include the nights when I stayed awake wondering how I would manage everything alone. I did not interrupt him. I did not shake my head. I simply listened, because I had learned that truth does not need anger to make it stronger. When my attorney asked me to share my experience, I looked forward instead of looking at Michael. I talked about Lily. I talked about the importance of stability. I talked about how children need consistency, care, and reassurance. I did not talk about revenge. I did not talk about making Michael feel guilty. I only talked about what was best for our daughter. At one point, there was a question about my recovery. I paused for a moment before answering. There was a time when I did not know if I would ever walk normally again, I said. But every day, I focused on what I could do, not what I had lost. That is how I have approached everything since then. Those words surprised even me because they were not just about walking. They were about my entire life. When the hearing ended for the day, I walked outside and stood on the courthouse steps. The outcome was not decided yet. There were still questions to answer. There were still things I could not control. But I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt proud of myself. Not because I had defeated anyone. Not because I had proven someone wrong. I felt proud because I had finally stopped seeing myself as the person who was left behind. I was the person who kept moving forward. And no matter what happened next, I knew that could never be taken away from me. I spent the days after the hearing thinking about something I never expected. I thought the hardest part would be standing in that courtroom and hearing my personal life discussed by people who did not know our story. I thought the hardest part would be seeing Michael across from me and remembering the promises we once made. But when I returned home that evening and saw Lily waiting for me with a smile, I realized something important. The most important part of my life was never the argument happening outside our home. It was the little girl inside it who needed a mother who was strong, calm, and present. The waiting period after the hearing was difficult. I had always been a person who liked answers. I liked knowing what came next. But this situation reminded me that some things are outside our control. I could not control what Michael said. I could not control how others viewed the situation. I could only control how I responded.
So I focused on the
things I could do. I continued my recovery exercises. I continued building a stable routine for Lily. I continued creating a home where she felt loved and safe. One afternoon, while we were sitting in the backyard, Lily picked a small flower and handed it to me. She was too young to understand everything that had happened between her parents, but she understood love. She understood comfort. She understood that I was always there. I held that flower in my hand and thought about how much had changed since the day I first woke up after my accident. Back then, I wondered if I would ever feel like myself again. I wondered if I would ever stop feeling like something important had been taken from me. But I realized that I was not the same person anymore. I was stronger because I had learned what I was capable of. A few days later, my attorney called with an update. She explained that the court had reviewed the information and considered the full picture. The decision focused on what was best for Lily and the stability she needed. Hearing those words brought a sense of relief, but it was not the kind of relief that came from winning against someone. It was the relief of knowing that the truth had been seen. After the decision, Michael and I had another conversation. It was not the conversation I once imagined having with him. There was no dramatic apology. There was no moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, we sat across from each other and talked honestly for the first time in a long while. Michael admitted that he had handled things poorly. He admitted that he had focused so much on his own feelings that he failed to understand what I had been experiencing. I listened quietly. Part of me wished I had heard those words months earlier. Part of me wished I had not needed to go through everything I went through to be understood. But another part of me knew something else. I had grown because of the journey, not because of his approval. I told him that I wanted us to find a healthier way to communicate for Lily's sake. She deserved parents who could put her needs before their disagreements. I did not want her to grow up surrounded by resentment. I wanted her to learn that people can make mistakes and still choose to do better. When I drove home that day, I looked at the road ahead and thought about all the steps I had taken. The physical steps during my recovery, the emotional steps after Michael left, the difficult steps toward accepting a new version of my life. I used to believe losing my marriage meant losing everything. Now I understood that sometimes losing what you depended on reveals what you truly have inside yourself. I had rebuilt my strength one day at a time. I had protected my daughter. I had found my voice. And no matter what happened in the future, I would never again forget the woman I had become. Months after everything happened, I found myself standing in my kitchen one quiet morning, watching sunlight come through the window and thinking about how different my life looked compared to the woman I used to be. The same room that once held so much uncertainty now felt peaceful. The same chair where I sat during the hardest days of my recovery was still there. The same table where I organized documents and worried about the future was still there. But I was different. For a long time, I believed my life had been divided into two parts. The life before everything changed, and the life after. I thought the accident had taken away my independence. I thought Michael leaving had taken away my family. I thought the court process had taken away my sense of security. But I finally understood that those moments did not take everything from me. They revealed parts of myself I had never been forced to discover before. I became stronger in ways I never expected. I learned patience. I learned courage. I learned that asking for help did not make me weak. Most importantly, I learned that my worth was never determined by whether someone stayed or walked away. Lily was growing quickly. Every day brought a new word, a new question, or a new little discovery. Watching her reminded me that children do not need perfect parents. They need parents who show up with love and consistency. That became my focus. I wanted to create a childhood for her filled with security, kindness, and happy memories. Michael and I were not the same couple we once were. Some things cannot simply return to the way they were before. Trust takes time to rebuild, and some changes become permanent. But we learned how to communicate better for Lily's sake. We learned how to separate our past from our responsibilities as parents. That was not always easy, but it was necessary. I no longer looked at Michael as the person who destroyed my life. I saw him as someone who made choices I could not change. And I saw myself as someone who had the power to choose what happened next. One afternoon, I found an old photograph from before my accident. It showed me and Michael smiling with baby Lily in our arms. I stared at that picture for a long time. In the past, seeing that image would have made me sad because I would have remembered everything I lost. But that day, I saw something different. I saw a woman who loved deeply. I saw a mother who had given everything she could. I saw someone who had no idea how strong she would become. I placed the photograph back in the drawer and smiled. That chapter of my life was important, but it was not the entire story. The biggest lesson I learned was that sometimes life forces us to begin again. Not because we failed, not because we were not enough, but because we are capable of becoming someone new. I once had to learn how to walk again. Step by step, day by day, I rebuilt my confidence. Then, I had to learn how to move forward emotionally after losing the future I thought I would have. That journey was harder, but it changed me in ways I will always carry. Today, when I look at Lily, I do not see the pain of the past. I see the reason I kept going. I see the little girl who gave me strength when I felt uncertain. I see the future I fought to protect. And when I look at myself, I no longer see the woman who was abandoned. I see the woman who stood back up. I see the woman who found her voice. I see the woman who discovered that even when someone walks away from you, you still have the power to keep moving forward.